Okay, so I'll start. So as I mentioned, as Soledad also mentioned, I'm going to present you the architecture of mass disinformation on digital platforms. And firstly, I am going to start a bit with some background that made this project possible. So within the European regulatory space, we have three very important pieces of regulation that help us build this project. First of all is the Digital Service Act, which is a piece of regulation that regulates digital platforms. This includes social network, app stores, marketplaces, in order to prevent illegal and harmful online content and ensures that there is platform accountability. Another piece of regulation is the code of conduct, which is actually a voluntary framework which was signed by the platforms to commit to certain transparency, demonetization of false content, and access to data commitments, although it's very important to mention that some of the platforms have resigned from this code of conduct, so not all of them are committed to it. Another piece of very important regulation is an article within the Digital Service Act, which is Article 4012, which allows researchers to get data access in order to study systemic risks such as disinformation, and platforms might provide this access to vetted researchers. I'm going to tell you a bit about the project. So as Soledad mentioned, it's called SIMONS, which stands for Structural Indicators to monitor online disinformation scientifically. I'm going to talk a lot about these structural indicators during this presentation. So we are thinking about them as these key performance indicators that we are trying to achieve throughout this project. So our goal was to assess the scale of misinformation across social media platforms over time, and we were trying to measure the impact of the code of conduct and the Digital Service Act on misinformation, on the misinformation space in Europe. We had a threefold approach. So we had tech experts which helped us to collect data at scale. This was our partners at Check First. We had EFCSN certified fact checkers, which assess content and identify disinformation. This was our partners at Neutral, Demagogue, and Pravda. And we had a team of scientists at the University of Alberta de Catalunya who helped us with the methodology and statistical analysis. The scope of the project was within 4 European countries. So we covered France, Spain, Poland, and Slovakia. And we covered 6 very large online platforms, a term that is used in the Digital Service Act. And those were TikTok, YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We had 2 measurement periods because we wanted to test the methodology to see that our results are strong. So the first period was between March and April, and the second period in the month of October 2025. So these structural indicators or key performance indicators that we measured throughout the report were the prevalence of misinformation, which is the proportion of content that users are exposed to on the platform that contains misinformation. We have sources, which is the relative influence of repeat misinformers versus credible sources on the platforms. Then we looked at the extent to which platforms are financially rewarding misinformers. The fourth one was the share of misinformation content which was produced by AI. And lastly, we looked at the growth rate or the followers increase in low credibility or misinformation and high credibility sources. Before I go to the results, I would like to walk you a bit through our methodology and how we started the data collection. As I mentioned, under the Digital Service Act, researchers have a possibility of asking platforms for a random sample of data. And we decided that for our project, 200,000 pieces of content were enough to study, and we contacted all of the platforms. In the second measurement period, we got a random sample of data from LinkedIn, and from TikTok and from YouTube, we got API access. for the platforms that we were not able to get a random sample of data, which were all of the other 5 platforms, we needed to come up with another methodology to download data. And that was that we queried the platform's native search with 100 keywords per language. And I am going to tell you how we built this keywords list and what was important for us. So because of the amount of information that is on the internet, and especially like very important information that people are consuming every day, we needed to focus only on a few topics that are relevant to the civic discourse and the information news space, and also to the misinformation space. So we selected 5 topics, which were local politics, the war in Ukraine, migration, health, and climate, which were, let's say, one of the most talked about, or they are some of the most talked about topics within European Union, and one might argue also internationally. We created these 2 lists of keywords. One was a list of neutral keywords, as we call it, which are just words that people or like news organizations use to describe these topics or like to talk about these particular topics. So one would be like COVID against vaccines against COVID, or migrants, or the Green Deal, or Ukrainian aid. And then in order for us to also get content that is more disinformation prone, we also had a list of balanced keywords that are keywords such as vaccine side effects, detox, climate alarmism, geoengineering, which are keywords that are more like associated with disinformation space, or like borderline content that can be interpreted as disinformation. Next, I'm going to tell you a bit about like the data sampling. So as I mentioned, we search for these topics using the keyword list. Each country had 100 and plus keywords, and searching for them, we collected 6 million posts within the 2 data collection period, and we covered all 5 topics. Because of the nature of how people use words online, for example, COVID or cancer and so on, we got like not a lot, but we got like some content that is irrelevant, because, for example, somebody might use COVID as a reference for a point in time. So during the COVID times, this football player didn't play during the games. Or when it comes to cancer, it's also like the zodiac sign. So within like all of these posts regarding these important topics, we also got relevant content, which we wanted to filter out using an LLM. So out of like the 3 million posts which we got in the second period, we filtered it out and we removed all of the sports media, religious content, celebrity gossip, and so on. Next, it was the process of sampling and creating a sample that can be labeled by the fact checkers, because we had fact checkers that had to annotate all of the content. Of course, we couldn't use tens and thousands of pieces of content. So what we decided to do is to sample our data set of 500 posts per platform per language, which will lead in 12,000 posts that our fact checkers we had to label. And we decided that the best solution would be to have a sample which is weighted by the number of views, because like this, it will reflect what the audiences were actually exposed to and what type of content, be it credible or misinformation, is actually viral on the platforms. Through that sampling, in the sample of the 12,000 posts from the data collection, from the first data collection, we had 2.6 billion views. And in the sample from the second data collection, which was in October 2025, we had 1.9 billion views. So like these 12,000 posts accumulated to quite a significant number of views. So we were quite sure that we were capturing viral posts within these 5 topics. As I mentioned, our fact checker had to label these posts in 9 different categories. The first 3 most obvious categories, what could say is that is the misinformation, which is content that is stating or clearly implying a false or misleading claim. Then we have credible or informative content, and then we have unverifiable content, which we defined as content that can be really classified as either credible or misinformation, but it is rather an opinion that people express on the internet, which is a lot of content, actually. We also have 4 other labels that we excluded from our analysis, but the fact checkers still could label this content in the sample. So even if we use an LLM to filter out irrelevant content, because no method is perfect, still some irrelevant content slipped into the 12,000 sample. So fact checkers still label that content as irrelevant, or if it was not in the targeted language or in English, or if that post was removed since we collected it and we got to the labeling process. And we also have the category of don't know, which is a category where we didn't know, like some posts maybe not fit in any of the other 8 labels, which it didn't happen actually, but we had it just in case. In order to introduce a bit more nuance for what type of content can be found online, we also introduced this new 2 categories or labels, which is borderline. And we define this as a type of content that feeds a misleading narrative or reinforces false beliefs in readers. And also the category of abusive, which is hate speech, insults, and hateful ideologies, or content that encourages harmful behavior. Here I have a couple of examples. So in the first one, in Misinformation, you can see an Instagram post which says that vaccines are toxic. We can see a video of on TikTok from a reputable source, which is talking about the microbiome, and then we have a LinkedIn post of an unverifiable piece of content, which is a personal story of curing cancer, which is neither credible nor misinformation. It's just somebody's opinion and experience. As for borderline, here we have X video, which fits the narrative that all migrants are criminals, which is not true, obviously, but it's also not a pure form of misinformation, as I would call it. Next, we have an abusive tweet, which uses racial slurs against Asian immigrants. And then we have a piece of irrelevant content, which slipped in through our data set, which is a post on LinkedIn celebrating National Daffodil Day. And now that I walked you through our methodology and you know like how we gather the sample, how we label it, I am going to tell you how we analyzed it. So our first indicator, the prevalence of misinformation, we're trying to see how much misinformation there is on social media platforms. And we found out that on TikTok, there was a 25% prevalence of misinformation, a 5% increase from our first measurement in March 2025, and also a 5% increase on YouTube, which rose from 8.5% to 12.3%. Another thing that we found was that LinkedIn was quite stable and consistent. So across both measurement periods, the prevalence was under 1.5%. As you can see on all of the other platforms, the prevalence is above 10%. Within our data sample of posts that were labeled by the fact checkers as misinformation, we looked a bit at the type of topics that were within this misleading post. So in both data collection, like in both measurement periods, health was the predominant topic. It is around 43% in our second report. Then it's followed by the war in Ukraine and national politics, which is quite a stable combination that it has been across like both our measurement periods. And it is not surprising, as you would see like in some of the next results, why health is like such a big topic. For the second indicator, we looked at sources of misinformation. So what we did is that we had a lot of accounts of credible sources, or how we call it high credibility misinformation, we call it low credibility, and then neither, which are accounts that are neither posting credible, no misinformation post, but we still thought it was relevant to include it in our analysis. What you can see here is the total number of posts that we collected for the accounts on these platforms. The next step was to analyze the number of interactions that these accounts get per 1,000 followers. Like, using this metric of interactions per 1,000 of followers, we were able to take into account accounts that had like a smaller audience, and then control for this value, which is the number of followers. So what you can see in these results is that on Instagram, for every 1,000 followers, misinformers, so the low credibility accounts, get 13 interactions, while the credible accounts get less than 5. So basically, misinformer gets 3 times as more interactions to their post than credible accounts get. It is the same story on Facebook. As you can see, it's almost 5 times as much, while on LinkedIn, the numbers are not comparable, so there's no statistical difference, but we also noticed before in the prevalence that on LinkedIn there are like very little misinformation accounts, and then you can see we were able to collect only 700 posts, and there were like very little accounts in general in our data set that had that were categorized as misinformers. The pattern continues on all platforms, as you can see, both on TikTok, on YouTube, and on Twitter. The misinformers have a significantly higher number of interactions per 1,000 followers. So what we call this, it's misinformation premium, where we define it as low credibility accounts which outperform high credibility accounts. And as you saw on Twitter and on YouTube, for example, there were 10 times or 11 times more interaction per post for the low credibility accounts in comparison with the high credibility accounts. And we noticed this pattern in our first and second report. So from the results are like quite consistent. They are either stable or they are rising, which is implying that the platforms are amplifying and rewarding repeat misinformers with their recommendation systems and based on the engagements that the posts are getting. So the platforms are not really taking in consideration where this post is accurate, or like what is this post trying to convey to people, but the number of engagements that it gets. We know that this is a structural problem. We have proved it time and time again, and we are currently still in the process of bringing more evidence on how this algorithmic amplification works within the engagement space on the social media platforms. Our third indicator was the monetization of misinformation. It is very important to mention that monetization data is not publicly accessible data because of the data privacy within Europe, and under the GDPR, we need to access data from the platforms. So they need to give it to us. We tried and we sent multiple data requests for monetization data, although we didn't get any results. The results that we have for YouTube and for Facebook are because they are open source. They have an open source on like an open data set where we could look for accounts that are being monetized. So on YouTube, we can see that within our data sample, 90% of the high credibility sources and 81% of the low credibility sources are eligible for monetization. And on Facebook, 51% in comparison to 22%. What is important to mention is that this number of low credibility sources should actually be 0. So it is not allowed for misinformation, for scams to be monetized on these platforms. But you can see on YouTube that the number of accounts that are being monetized or that are eligible for monetization is almost as high for high credibility sources. There's absolutely no difference if you are a YouTuber that is sharing misinformation about elections, or if you are a YouTuber that is talking about the current state of affairs and you are sharing news from reputable news sources. Our next indicator was the AI-generated misinformation. So in this data sample of 12,000 posts that we have, we identified a lot of posts that contain misinformation, and between those, we looked how many of them were AI generated, and we realized that 24% of disinformation on TikTok is AI generated, and on YouTube it was 19%, which are quite significant numbers. Another discovery was that only 16.5% of this content carries an AI label, which is quite important because as AI evolves, these videos or these photos are getting more and more realistic, and especially when they are depicting really real events, it's very difficult to distinguish them. The platforms don't have any obligation to label this content, although in their terms and conditions they stipulate that the users need to label content that is fully or partially AI generated, although there is no enforcement on what would happen if you would not do that. So there is an open end there. Another thing we discovered was that 61% of AI-generated disinformation on YouTube concerned health topics and 57% on TikTok. So as I mentioned, the health misinformation is a big trend in our reports. Another interesting statistic was that the cumulative views of AI-generated content was 34 million views, and not surprisingly, TikTok accounts for 69% of those views. Here I have video from our data set, which is of an AI-generated persona impersonating a medical professional that is spreading health disinformation. It has the label of Dr. Isabella Navarro, which again is an AI-generated persona, not a doctor. It had, at the time when the report was written, it had approximately 28,000 subscribers, 62,000 views for this video, and there was no label, AI label applied by YouTube or by the creator. And not only that, but at the time of the collection, this video was also monetized by YouTube, and the creator was also part of the YouTube partnership program, which implies that the content is also the creator is getting money from YouTube for their content. Our first and last indicator is audience growth, which is an indicator that we created to track how the number of followers, how platforms, or like how the accounts are growing in their number of followers. On all of the platforms that we looked on, there was no significant difference between high credibility and low credibility accounts. So they were gaining followers at a similar rate. Although for Twitter, we found out that low credibility accounts were growing their audience 3.5% faster than credible accounts. This is still an ongoing project, and we are trying to track it over time to see if this is a pattern that is consistent across time. Lastly, I am going to go through our recommendations. So what is important that this measurement of misinformation continues is that we have an independent fund that is sustainable. So this type of study is value only if it emerges over time, and if it's funding independent researchers and in trying to detect these trends. Another important factor would be to label deceptive AI-generated content. As I mentioned, there were like only 16.5% of content was labeled. The platforms have no guidelines on how to introduce these labels. All of them have their own ways of either showing the labels or not, or penalizing users, and there is no consensus among them, and there is no regulatory framework that is imposing this AI labeling. And lastly, we are suggesting of integrating CIMAD's indicators into the DSA monitoring. So because these indicators are comparable and reproducible and grounded in independent methodology, we would want to use them as KPIs in DSA compliance audits. And also this could be integrated at an international level. So as independent bodies could incorporate this type of research into independent audits of the platforms within any geographical space.